Donald Trump did it again today. He did what he always does when he talks about 9/11. He lied. This time he told a new lie. And the proof that it is a lie is right there in the video recording of what the president said. The proof is the silence after the president said it, a silence that speaks the truth to the president's lie. Today, Donald Trump profanely and falsely tried to include himself among the very brave people who went to Ground Zero, where the World Trade Center once stood, and exposed themselves to the toxic debris there that made so many of the first responders fall ill, some fatally ill. Here is President Trump reading his teleprompter today at the bill signing of the 9/11 Victims' Compensation Fund, a bill that the president did absolutely nothing to help pass.
Many of those affected were firefighters, police officers, and other first responders. And I was down there also, but I'm not considering myself a first responder, but I was down there. I spent a lot of time down there with you. Since September 11th, we have lost more than 2,000 first responders and survivors to 9/11 related cancers and illnesses.
You notice it's when the president goes off his teleprompter that he adds his grotesque lie. I was down there also, but I'm not considering myself a first responder. But I was down there. I spent a lot of time down there with you. And that statement was greeted by silence from the people in that audience who were down there. If Donald Trump spent a lot of time down there with them, they would have applauded. Instead, the people who know the truth were silent. Richard Alls was a deputy chief with the New York Fire Department on 9/11 and was in the Rose Garden today when the president lied to his face. He told the New York Times today that he spent many months at Ground Zero and he never saw Donald Trump. Mr. Alls told the Times he had vivid memories of other people being there, like Democratic Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, who was one of the sponsors of the bill that the president signed today. But Carolyn Maloney's office said that she was not invited to the White House bill signing. This is what makes Donald Trump such a pathological liar, that he will lie directly to people who he knows the truth. Now, we're going to run that video of the lie once again so that you can watch the pathological process he goes through. And I think what you will see on his face in the small space that he leaves for applause is the very quick realization that he is more likely to get booed for his deplorable lie, and so he chooses to race on to the next sentence in his teleprompter. Take another look.
Many of those affected were firefighters, police officers, and other first responders. And I was down there also, but I'm not considering myself a first responder. But I was down there. I spent a lot of time down there with you. Since September 11th, we have...
It's not the worst lie he's told about 9/11. His worst lie about 9/11 was a lie he told only twice in about a 12-hour period and then never told it again. And the fact that he did not tell that lie again today is further proof that it is a lie. And it is a lie that he got away with because when you look at the lists of Trump 9/11 lies that most news reports have assembled today, this lie isn't on most of those lists. And so it remains the great forgotten Trump lie about 9/11. In the South Carolina Republican primary debate, Donald Trump told the lie that he lost hundreds of friends on 9/11.
How did he keep us safe when the World Trade Center came down? The world, I lost hundreds of friends.
I immediately tweeted that that was a lie when I heard him say it that night. And the next day on Meet the Press, Donald Trump reduced his lie to, quote, many, many friends.
I was there. I lost many, many friends in that tragedy.
And I immediately tweeted that that was also a lie. And Donald Trump never said it again. Donald Trump lost 0 friends on 9/11. Donald Trump attended 0 9/11 funerals. 0. Not hundreds, 0. And if Donald Trump had attended even a single 9/11 funeral, if Donald Trump had lost even a single distant acquaintance on 9/11, you would have heard about that today. If Donald Trump lost many, many friends on 9/11, you would have heard about that today. So Donald Trump's silence today about his own lying claim of suffering the loss of hundreds of friends on 9/11 proves once again that he was lying when he tried to steal the grief of the people who lost loved ones on 9/11 and make that grief his own. And it proves once again that Donald Trump will lie to anyone at any time, in any place, on any occasion, no matter how sacred or solemn, about anything. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.